We've already covered the topic of the enemy making capacity that exists inside of us all. So, in this lesson, we're taking the discussion around the psychology of the enemy further by applying some of the rules from this unique little book, which is Finite and Infinite Games by James Cass. And the subtitle for this book is particularly important as well, a vision of life as play and possibility. So, we'll focus on this a little bit later on. So we're going to consider the difference between a finite and an infinite game first, and then apply that to the enemy-making tendency that we've already begun exploring, and then discuss a wide range of quotes taken directly from this book. And there's a lot to be hopeful and optimistic about on the individual level, and this can act as a practical guide of moving away from Homo hostilis, the enemy-making human, and towards Homo amicus, the friendly human. And the key point to address is this. How we find ourselves in the future will be decided on which type of game we decide to play. So, firstly, we have finite games. Finite games are played for the purpose of winning. With that in mind, they need clearly defined rules and boundaries and agreed upon endpoints, so it's clear who is the winner and who is the loser. Depending on the game, players might compete for titles or for recognition or for power or for resources and so on. And once someone wins, the game is over. Now, this is important because it means that the meaning of a finite game is externally defined. The success depends on how others judge your performance and also what the rules are in the first place. This also means that you can't play a finite game alone. It's always played in a specific place and with those specific people who are playing the specific game at that specific time. These finite games only work when the rules are clear and fixed, so you can't just change these rules mid-game. If we apply this to our discussion on the enemy, then a finite game requires opposition. It requires someone to play against, which might be an enemy to defeat or to outshine or just to show superiority towards. Now, I appreciate if you're playing a board game, then enemy is quite a strong word, but technically that's what they are. The foe or the opposition or the rival. And also, just while we're here as well, a finite game ends with closure in that it finishes what it started. So, for example, if two people sit down to play a game of chess, then there are clearly defined rules about how the game will go ahead, what is expected of each player, the rules that each piece has to obey, there's an agreed starting structure, and the game clearly ends when there is a checkmate, or a stalemate, or a resignation if you're a bit more particular. But the important point is that this specific chess match ends. You can probably see where I'm going with this, but I just want to spell out infinite games as well to make all this super clear. So, infinite games are the opposite, and they're played with the goal of continuing the play, not of winning. This means that the rules are able to change and the game can be adapted to keep itself going. So introducing a new rule mid-game would destroy a finite game, but it's a very welcome addition for an infinite game. It can add to the surprise factor and it can expand what is possible for all the players involved in a potentially positive way. So the meaning that the player gets from the infinite game is internally generated. It doesn't matter externally what others agree or disagree with because I'm not playing to defeat them. I'm playing for the purpose of playing the game itself. So it's not just that an enemy here is not specifically a threat, but that they can actually take on more of a positive role if it means that they can help to elongate the game itself. Playing an infinite game is more about playing with creativity and adaptation in this ongoing way. There's no final victory over another person. Instead, there's an ongoing participation of the game itself. So if we go back to that chess example, then an infinite game would be more like tutoring someone in chess to help them develop their techniques and their strategies. The focus isn't on the teacher being better than the student and defeating them, but it's on the process and it's the connection and promoting the game to the next generation so that it can be continued to play for years to come. And one of my favourite quotes in this entire book is on section 11, which summarises this perfectly. Finite players play within boundaries, infinite players play with boundaries. Any specific chess match has a winner and a loser according to the rules. It's a finite game. But continuing the interest and the passion for chess playing for hundreds of years to come is going to be a much more open, expansive, and creative pursuit. It's an infinite game. And I've intentionally left this wording very open so that you can see how it can apply to many wider areas than just this particular topic for today. So why have I spent so long going over the definitions for these two types of games? Well, it's because of the enormous hidden potential that is revealed in the structure of how the game itself is set up. It tells us not only what we're trying to do, but also how we're going to do it, for what purpose, for how long, and what the rules are that we must follow, or that we're allowed to break. And this opens up so much more freedom than we thought possible, or it limits our freedom in ways that we couldn't quite realize at first. So we need to be careful when we make enemies and establish opposition, because enemy making is a finite game. Now, to be clear, following on from the previous lesson on Homo hostilis, we are looking at this on the individual level, not the national or the governmental level. So that way we can make it a lot more practical. And for the rest of this lesson, I'm going to be giving direct passages from this book itself to help us move away from playing finite games unnecessarily and instead prioritize playing infinite games. For our purposes, enemy making is a finite game, outgrowing the need for an enemy is an infinite game. So, to quote section 29, where the finite player plays to be powerful, the infinite player plays with strength. To the extent that we develop our strength purely so that we can outcompete another or defeat them, then we are playing a finite game. And it sours and it ruins what could be a moment of beauty. So, for example, if instead of going to the gym to become stronger and healthier for yourself, so that your own life can be more enjoyable for you, it would be training simply to prove to other people that you are stronger than them. So it's a vanity metric. This person is playing to be powerful in relation to someone else rather than stronger for himself. It's based on survival and defense and, ironically, weakness as well. In terms of enemy making, we need to learn to outgrow the need to better an opponent and instead see the other gym goers as allies and as teammates. Everyone working communally, but at the same time on themselves individually, so that strength and health are encouraged. The purpose is to maintain momentum and to keep developing fitness, to keep the strength game going. And this is echoed in section 48. What will undo any boundary is the awareness that it is our vision and not what we are viewing that is limited. So enemy making is a pointless game in the long run. It's not just insulting to others, but it's insulting to ourselves as well. We need to practice raising our self-esteem and to dream for more than ourselves. It's our vision that is limited. It's our creativity, our uniqueness, and our wisdom and our curiosity that is limited. Rather than looking at another person and seeing ways to defeat them, we need to learn to change how we even look at that other person. How can we reveal to ourselves via the other person what we need to develop in ourselves? Now, this is deep into shadow work territory here, and it can be extremely refreshing to actually reframe this other person as a source of transformation. And another way of saying this is by considering jealousy. So if we realize that we are envious or jealous of another person, then the psychologically immature individual will simply either deny the envy or ignore it or suppress it or create a story about the other person which bypasses the experience of envy altogether. The idea that someone else could be better than they are is too much, because if you're playing in a finite game, then that means that you are losing in comparison to them in practicing that particular trait. Now, the beauty of shadow work is reclaiming that and integrating that trait. Realizing and accepting that there is something in them that you are envious of, and that this reveals something about yourself that you truly want and desire from yourself in the future, and using that as a prompt to see that change in yourself. We should be thankful for envy, not dismissive. But this only makes sense if we view the rules according to the infinite game structure. They're not an enemy to be jealous of. They're the teammate who, unknowingly, has helped you to understand yourself on a deeper level. And this isn't a clever play on words or manipulation. This is how you change on the philosophical level at the deepest degree. You don't change what you're looking at, you rethink the eyes that are seeing. And section 17 backs this up beautifully. To be prepared against surprise is to be trained. To be prepared for surprise is to be educated. We want to start playing infinite games, and that means we are looking to constantly self-educate. We don't need to be constantly putting up defenses and barriers all the time and wasting energy defending them against the opposition. We need to be educated and anticipate the surprise ahead of time. So to combine the chess example from before with the envy example, I want to celebrate the skill of the player that defeated me in a particular game so that I can develop my own strategies for the future. And perhaps this other person will be willing to tutor me or mentor me to become better at that game. And perhaps then I could pay that forward and help to teach others who are below my skill level. So the bitterness of defeat doesn't need to be as hard hitting if we can stop seeing it as defeat. Rather than preparing against the surprise of being defeated, perhaps I can be prepared for the display of skill and then to celebrate it when I witness it. So by reframing the enemy as a skilled competitor, I get a chance to celebrate their skill. Maybe then I even want to be defeated, if being defeated means I get to witness something spectacular. And notice how in all of this, we're using this inbuilt capacity of the tool-making human for good. It doesn't necessarily have to funnel towards enemy-making human. So taking this thought a little bit further with section 24, the joyfulness of infinite play, its laughter, lies in learning to start something that we cannot finish. We can delight in the defeat by thinking about how far it can actually progress myself, others, and humanity on a wider scale. So imagine how dull the Olympic Games would be if the focus was simply on defeating the other athletes. Instead, notice how much higher the esteem of the Olympics can be held when it is focused on witnessing the highest human potential across so many disciplines. And then in 4 years' time, seeing what was an incredible world record already being broken by an even more incredible display. That's an infinite game being played across decades. And even if no records are broken, we can still delight in seeing the athletes push themselves to their absolute limits. The joy is in the continued performance, not the moment of winning or losing. We don't need to explain why we enjoy witnessing this, but we just simply need to notice the experience of enjoyment itself. We need to move away from explanation and toward narrative. So to quote section 73, explanations settle issues, showing that matters must end as they have. Narratives raise issues, showing that matters do not end as they must, but as they do. Explanation sets the need for further inquiry aside. Narrative invites us to rethink what we thought we knew. So going back to the enemy creating tendency, the focus often drifts towards explaining why I'm right and they're wrong, how I'm good and they're evil, how I'm the hero and they're the villain. But rather than defending this and offering an alternative explanation, we could simply bypass explanation altogether. We need to learn to embrace narratives and storytelling, and this opens up the doorway for new ways to think about the future and also our past as well. Like the jealousy example, it's not about explaining why we aren't in fact jealous at all, but rather accepting that and seeing that as a catalyst for our growth and our development. Thanking the enemy or the opposition rather than trying to defeat them. And a defeat for them might be satisfying for us in the short term, but is ultimately a long-term slow defeat for ourselves because we'll stifle who we could become. Now, as you can probably tell, I could go on about this book for a long, long time. It's wonderful and it develops this theme much, much further. But I'm going to offer one last quote here just to tie it back to shadow work. And it concerns something that we never particularly want to look at physically or emotionally or mentally or spiritually, but we can't deny it. And that is the topic of waste. So section 90. The more waste a society produces, the more unveiling that waste is. And thus, the more vigorously must a society deny that it produces any waste at all. The more it must dispose or hide or ignore its detritus. Now, let's replace society with the individual to help make this practical, and then we can reread it then. The more waste we produce, the more unveiling that waste is, and thus the more vigorously must we deny that we produce any waste at all. The more we must dispose or hide or ignore our detritus. So instead of dumping our baggage unfairly on the enemy, perhaps we need to rethink about what it is that we're dumping in the first place. Waste is only a problem if we're playing a finite game. It reveals to us what type of player we are, and if we don't like it, so if we don't want to be considered losers of the ethical game, then we must do something with the glaring problem before other players see it. Now, we can try and explain it away all we want, but we know that's irrelevant. Waste isn't a result of what we have made, it is what we have made. So we need to change the narrative. In enemy making, rather than dumping our emotional and psychological waste onto them, we need to take a good close look at what this waste actually is, what it actually contains, the potentially good and the potentially bad, and then we need to reclaim what is rightfully ours and integrate it. And this is the call of shadow work, the unconscious self. And as I said earlier, the subtitle for this book is A Vision of Life as Play and Possibility. There is no element of possibility within the enemy game other than victory or defeat, because it is a finite game. So there's certainly no play available either, because this is a serious game played by serious players. If we're to become Homo amicus, that friendly human, then we need to reconsider what we are living for and how we will live it. And we've already looked at how we can misuse this tool-making capacity inside of us. And now we've considered how we can actually start to use it for good. So, 3 final questions to bring all of this to a close. What finite games are you currently playing, and how can you turn them into infinite games? Number 2, when you think of a specific person as the opposition, what can you now celebrate in them? How can you begin to celebrate this in yourself? And number 3, what is one piece of waste that you've dumped onto another person that you'd be willing to take back? And how might this waste be turned into fertilizer to promote your own growth? In case it's not already obvious, I highly recommend this book, Finite and Infinite Games by James Carse.